Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to talk about what I call the rise of the deception machines. And yes, when I talk about deception machines, I do mean large language model powered chatbots. Things like ChatGPT, DeepSeek, Claude, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to argue that in order to understand this technology and what it's doing to us, we need to think about that in terms of deception. But I want to stress immediately that the deception I'm thinking of has nothing to do with the well-known fact that these models, these chatbots, can sometimes give us false answers, that they can lie or hallucinate, as industry insiders like to call it. I don't think that that is the core phenomenon, the most interesting phenomenon. I'm even a little bit skeptical that it's a phenomenon at all. I'll give you some reason later on to think that actually no chatbot has ever said anything that was false. But we'll get to that, and it's not going to be the main point. The main point is going to be that in order to understand our interactions with these chatbots, we have to be aware of them as enabling or being based on two kinds of deception. First, it's the companies that deceive us into thinking that the technology is something that it's not. That's the first kind of deception I'm going to talk about. And the second kind of deception, which is in some ways even more interesting, and I think maybe even more pernicious, is that we then use these chatbots to deceive ourselves. These chatbots are the best tools of self-deception that have so far been developed. That's going to be my main thesis, my main argument. But before I can get there, I've got to say something about what the technology is and how it works. Maybe you already know this, but maybe a lot of you don't, and I'll give you a very brief primer. So, inside these chatbots is something called a large language model. And a large language model is essentially a piece of computer code, by now an extremely large piece of computer code, that has been trained on a huge amount of texts, most of them kind of stolen from everywhere that you can steal text from. They've been trained on these texts in order to successfully predict words. Right? So what you do is you give a large language model a piece of text, and then what it generates is essentially a list of words that could come next, with probabilities. Right? So if you give it a text that says the day after Tuesday is, well, they're probably going to say Wednesday, 90% chance. But it could be another word, right? I mean, the day after Tuesday is Wednesday, makes a lot of sense, but the day after Tuesday is my favorite day of the week. That makes some sense. So my is going to get some positive probability. The day after Tuesday is not Thursday. I mean, that's not going to appear a lot, but it's possible that not is the next word. And so that's what a large language model is, right? It is a thing that has become very good at predicting what the next word of a sentence might be. And if you let it not just predict something, but then also choose among those things, so maybe you choose the one with the highest probability, or maybe you sometimes choose the one with the highest probability, but to mix things up, you also go lower down the list in other occasions. If you do that and you add the chosen words to the text, you can have an LLM sort of complete a text, right? And so you can take an LLM and you can say, for breakfast I had, and then it's going to happily churn out a text that makes sense and that starts with the words for breakfast I had, right? So maybe it's going to be, for breakfast I had some cereal with a cup of black coffee, and then I opened the newspaper to see that my OpenAI stocks had crashed, or something like that. I mean, it could go in many, many different directions because it's always going to be probabilistic. Now, there is nothing in this large language model itself that, on the one hand, sort of gives you the suggestion that you are talking to an entity. I mean, there's just a text that is being sort of completed. And unless this text is in the first person, there's probably never going to appear an I, like a first person I person in this text, right? A large language model is not in itself something that talks about itself or that talks about itself in the first person or something like that. That's just not there in the large language model. And also, I don't think that a large language model is the kind of thing where we would usually claim that it generates things that are true or false. In more or less the same way that we don't claim that books of fiction are true or false. Right? If you pick up The Lord of the Rings and you open it up at a random page and it says, "Then Frodo stubbed his toe," well, is that sentence true? Is it false? It's neither. I mean, this is not the kind of text that makes claims that can be true or false, because it's not trying to convey facts or something like that. It is not aimed at the truth, and so it can't hit or miss the truth. That's not what's going on in The Lord of the Rings or in another book of fiction. And arguably, the same is true for a large language model, right? You give it a piece of text, it's going to complete it, and you end up with, if it's successful, with something that is sensible, that looks like it could be real. But real is not the same as true, right? So it looks like something that could be real. If the large language model is kind of bad, doesn't work very well in this instance, then it's going to generate a text that doesn't look like it could be real, right? It looks like nonsensical or, just not the kind of thing that you could find out there in the wild. And so, what's going on with these texts generated by large language models just isn't that they are true or false. It's more that they are successful or unsuccessful at mimicking real-life texts. I think that's the sort of way that you ought to think about large language models. So, remember that, right? There's no I or first person inside typical large language model output, unless you put it in specifically. And we don't really have to think about it in terms of truth or falsity at all. Now, here's something interesting. You can actually use large language models in order to get answers to questions that you have where truth or falsity are important to you. And not when you put in "for breakfast I had," because how could it possibly know what you had for breakfast? But if you put in something like, the capital of Paris is, the capital of Paris, the capital of France is, it's probably going to put out Paris. Right? I mean, it's seen a lot of texts that talk about Paris as the capital of France, so probably it's going to say Paris. And so if you can't remember what the capital of France is, well, one way to find out, maybe not the best, but one way to find out is to write "the capital of France is," give it to a large language model, and see Paris pop up. Of course, something else could pop up. I mean, the large language model could plausibly write something like "the capital of France is London," said Jack, the not-so-bright student, and his teacher sighed in despair. I mean, that's a totally sensible text. So if you don't want that, maybe you add something to your prompt, right? Maybe you say something like, "The following is an excerpt from a perfectly reliable encyclopedia. The capital of France is..." And probably if that's your prompt, right, if you first say "perfectly reliable encyclopedia," then the probability that the large language model is going to say Paris goes up. And the probability that it's going to say "London," said Jack, the not-so-bright student, is going to go down, because that doesn't look like an accurate encyclopedia entry. So you can steer large language models towards the kind of output that you want by putting in more text, right? By giving it some context in which to interpret your text and then continue it. So, companies using these large language models inside chatbots, like ChatGPT, DeepSeek, and so on, which is how most of us are now experiencing these large language models, they do basically exactly that. They do more than that, but this is one of the things that they do, is that they just add a lot of context for the large language model that you as a user are not seeing. So you can imagine that what ChatGPT is sort of really doing, it is you type something like you say, what's the capital of France? And then instead of sending that to the large language model, right, what it sends to the large language model is something like, this text is a conversation between a user and a very accurate, very helpful, very nice artificial intelligence assistant that consists of questions by the user that start with user and then answers by the artificial intelligence that start with artificial intelligence. And then it says, user, what is the capital of France? Artificial intelligence. And then the large language model starts churning, right? And it's going to create the continuation of this text that talks about, or that sort of starts by proclaiming itself to be a conversation between a user and an artificial intelligence assistant. And so it's probably going to say something like Paris. And if you add more, if you tell the large language model to write this text such that there is an I, that the artificial intelligence assistant calls themselves I, that they always ask helpful questions at the end, like, would you also like me to do this and that? Would you like me to write down a list of all the capitals of Western European countries? Would you like me to tell you about some of the nicest things that you can actually see in Paris if you ever go there? Would you like me to tell you about the most famous people called Paris? That's, if you give it that kind of instruction, like you put it at the top of the text, then of course it's going to generate something that looks like that. Now you, as a user, don't see those instructions, right? What you see is something that looks like the answers of some artificial intelligence agent that thinks of itself as a first person, as an I, and that's trying to be really helpful. And that's trying to answer questions, which is not what's going on. Right? There is no first-person agent there. Nobody is answering questions. There's just a piece of computer code that is generating more text in order to make it look like pre-existing texts. That's what's going on. But you are being sort of misled into thinking about the situation in a different way. And then what these companies do is they actually add a lot more wheels to this machine to make this more misleading, right? So they instruct the large language model, or maybe some layer around the large language model. I don't think we know exactly. I don't think they give us all the technical details always, because that's, of course, company secret. But you're going to see large language models, or these chatbots rather, say things like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. Or, oh, I can't tell you because it would be immoral or illegal for me to go into that direction. And of course, I mean, that's not something that a large language model sort of itself would normally do, because it's not itself normally something that even has concepts like I know or I'm allowed to do or whatever. No, I mean, what you do is you instruct it in such a way, and maybe you build some layers of protection around it in such a way that it generates messages talking about itself in the first person, talking about its own knowledge, its own certainty, what it's allowed to do, and so on and so forth. So you build all these things around it that make it look more and more and more like an artificial intelligent agent that is actually trying to answer your questions. And then, of course, as a user, when you get answers to your questions that are wrong, and come on, you get answers to your questions that are wrong a lot of the time, it looks like something really weird is happening, right? How is this artificial intelligence that is supposed to share its knowledge with you, at some moments actually sharing its knowledge with you, and at other moments, wow, it just makes something up? Why does it do that? That's kind of evil. Well, no, it's not kind of evil. Making things up is the only thing it can do, and those things sometimes look like true answers. But that was never sort of what the large language model was engaged in, and so it's not even malfunctioning when it tells you something that is not true, because really its success criterion was never to say something that is true. It wasn't built to say something that is true. It wasn't built to evaluate things for truth. It does not have a store of knowledge. It does not have a store of beliefs, and so on and so forth. That's just not what the technology is. And so, I mean, people like to talk about, oh, it's lying to you, or it's hallucinating, as if something really weird is going on. But nothing weird is going on. It's just a large language model being a large language model. And it looks weird only because of this deceptive layer of a first-person agent trying to answer questions that these companies have sort of built around it. That's what makes it look weird. Is it because those companies want the chatbots to look weird? No, I don't think they want the chatbots to look weird, but they want the chatbots to look smart, and they want them to look like helpful first-person agents who want to answer your questions. Because that seems a lot more impressive and a lot more trustworthy than these large language models themselves, which are basically, like, very obviously, when you interact with them, just continuing whatever text you put into it, right? And if you put a text into it that looks very inaccurate, it might continue it in a very inaccurate way, because that's what fits, right? So a lot of, like, the marketing speak, I suppose, of these companies is dependent on you experiencing your interaction with the large language model through this chatbot interface and being deceived into thinking that you are having a different kind of interaction from what you are actually having. And when it comes to the idea that, oh, these chatbots are on the verge of artificial general intelligence and they're already so smart and they're going to be able to do this and that, I think it also really helps if you think that, oh, they are already very knowledgeable and thinking about stuff and so on and so forth. Okay, so if there's anything wrong with these kinds of chatbots, right, if it's a technology that we should be wary of, I don't think that it's primarily about some of the answers being wrong. Because that's, first of all, sort of inherent in the very technology. But it's also, like, it's not something that we now need to fix by making them a little bit more accurate. I mean, that's the story that we're sometimes told. Well, we're going to make the models better and they'll be more accurate, there'll be fewer hallucinations and so on and so forth. You've got to strip away the illusion, right? See the large language model for what it is. Then you will realize that it was never sort of hallucinating at all. It was never sort of telling you lies or falsehoods even, really, because that's not the business that it's in. It's not the business that it's in, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that in pushing this technology further, you're going to get to a point where it's more trustworthy in the sense of trustworthiness that you want, right? And the sense of trustworthiness that you want, I think, I mean, suppose that you think of one of these things as your co-worker. I mean, what do you want from your co-worker? Do you want them to tell you the truth all the time? I don't tell my co-workers the truth all the time. I mean, what do you think about my new shirt? I love it. Was that the truth? I don't know. When are you going to look at my email? Oh, as soon as possible. Well, that's definitely not true. When I say as soon as possible, probably not true, right? No, but I mean, when I actually do the work, I'm going to really do my best. I'm going to sort of not send people something that I didn't check, that I didn't think about, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can rely on me, right? I'm a reliable person. And there's very little reason to believe that large language model technology could be reliable in that sense, as long as you take it for something that it's not. Right? I think large language models, they're very successful. They are now extremely reliable in generating text continuations that look fairly plausible. They're very reliable in that, in what they do. Are they ever going to be like reliable in answering questions? I mean, that's not even what they're... It's not their task. It's not their thing. Right? I mean, how could the idea of reliability even really apply to that? Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Right? It's like these AI companies are setting up these chatbot interfaces for us rather than giving us the large language models themselves. And in doing so, they kind of deceive us into believing that this technology is different from what it really is. And that makes us a lot less able to decide for ourselves when it's useful to use it, when it's not useful to use it, and so on and so forth. Right? So that is, I think, very problematic. It would be a lot less problematic to engage with the large language models themselves, even though there are questions about copyright and a lot of other ethical things and environmental footprint and so on and so forth. But at least some of the problems would be solved if we were just sort of directly interacting with the large language models without this deceptive screen of the chatbot around it. Okay, but here's the second thing, which for me is even more interesting, I think. The way that these things work now, with these chatbots around them, turns the large language model into an incredibly powerful and seductive tool of self-deception. What do I mean with that? Well, what happens when you go to a chatbot, something like ChatGPT, with, let's say, a sort of half-baked philosophical idea? Right? You've got some idea and you think, is this a good idea? Did anyone else say something about that? What could you argue against it? Okay, and so you describe your idea to ChatGPT. And you say, what do you think of this idea? And you press enter. I'll tell you what it's going to say. It's going to say, wow, that's a really interesting thought that you have there. It reminds me of this, and you could develop it in that and that way, and wow, it could be very fruitful to do that. Do you want me to say something nice about it in this and this way? And you're like, oh, that's a pretty good idea then. Yeah, okay. And maybe you make some more talk with ChatGPT. You say, yeah, what about this? And it says, oh yeah, that's a great way to develop that idea, and blah, blah. And all the time, what it's going to do is it's going to tell you that you are very smart and intelligent and original and beautiful and nice, and that your ideas are wonderful, and that they link up to some of the most famous and well-known ideas in the history of philosophy, and it's fairly perfect, and that there is a lot of room to fruitfully develop them, and that it's going to help you develop them, and oh, here are some nice things you could also say. And all the while, you are feeling this little glow, right? I don't think you're like totally conscious of feeling nice because you're flattered by a chatbot, because if you were totally conscious of it, then you would probably think, oh, it's only a chatbot. But it's very hard to not get a little bit of a comfortable, cozy feel from this very positive appraisal of your idea. And this but this seeming person who is thinking along with you and validating your ideas and strengthening them, it feels like thinking, and it feels like having a discussion. It feels like thinking through an idea and developing it, but you're actually looking into a mirror that has been specifically designed to make you feel good. Because that's what these chatbots are, right? They've been specifically designed to make you feel good. Why? The key word is engagement, right? Every website, and I think we know this by now, wants one thing. It wants to keep you there. Right? Why on earth do things like Twitter and Facebook and so on not just give you, the people you follow in sort of like, these are the things that are probably most interesting to you, and then it stops and you have to click a link to maybe get to something else? Of course not. They give you an infinite list, right? Where things that are interesting to you are interspersed with maybe other things, but it's all designed with only one aim, which is to make you scroll on that website for as long as possible, right? To spend as many minutes as possible with your Facebook app or Twitter app or whatever. I've heard, I haven't done this research myself, I've been told that Google has actually sort of worsened its search results so that you have to spend more time looking along the page to find what you were actually looking for, seeing more ads? Well, definitely something like ChatGPT. I mean, if you've got like 3 options, you can make it sound very neutral, you can make it sound grumpy and critical, or you can make it sound like a sort of flattering, comfortable, nice person who is always making you feel good about yourself. Which of those 3 chatbot personalities is going to drive engagement most? It's the last one, right? And that is why ChatGPT sounds exactly like that. It's always validating you. It's like if you ask it about music, you just ask it a factual question about music and it's going to go out of its way to tell you that you've got such a great taste in music. I mean, you didn't ask that, but it's kind of hard not to feel good about it, right? I mean, you were looking into obscure early 80s goth rock and it says, oh, you've got a good taste. You're like, wow, even ChatGPT likes obscure early 80s goth rock. I mean, I have some pretty good taste. And you don't think it consciously, but it happens, right? It happens. And then, of course, it asks you always at the end some questions about how it can keep helping you and can it do this for you and it's all so nice, right? And it is so completely different from taking your ideas, for instance, your philosophical ideas, to a real person, right? If I have a philosophical idea and I take it to a real person, then, well, maybe they're a first-year student who's really impressed and they're like, oh, interesting. Well, that is not so flattering. And if they're a first-year student who's a little bit less impressed, or if they are one of my colleagues or one of my master students or whatever, they're going to be like, yeah, I don't know. What about this? And did you think about that? And actually, I disagree with you about... I mean, that is not very comfortable, right? I mean, you've got to be there. You've got to defend your ideas. Maybe you're wrong. You've got to stare failure in the face. But that's what critical thinking is all about. When you interact with these kind of chatbots, you're not staring failure in the face ever. But you're also not engaged in critical reflection. But it can seem like you're engaged in critical reflection and thinking and developing your thoughts and so on and so forth. That, I would say, is a massive case of self-deception, which has never been possible on this scale. Or in anything like this form. I mean, what kind of technology have we had that can make you feel good about your own ideas? Well, I think it used to be the case that the only technology that could do that was just communication with other people and then some way of finding people who already thought the very same thing that you did. But that's not so easy. It's still gonna mean engaging with other people who might actually not agree with you about everything. And what these chatbots do is they create an arena where you can always be right and smart and where thinking becomes saying yes to your own ideas more and more enthusiastically. And what I am actually more afraid of than chatbots giving like false answers or something like that is that it's gonna turn people who use it a lot, and I think it's very easy to become a person who uses it a lot, in part because it feels so nice and comfortable. It's gonna sap your critical reasoning skills. It's gonna deceive you into thinking that you've thought and into thinking that your thoughts were good when you haven't really thought, and there's very little reason to believe that your thoughts are good. And I'm afraid that that is something that I'm going to see in people's work, in people's ideas, and so on and so forth. And if I were to warn my students against using this kind of technology, it would not be because maybe it says something false about Descartes or because it says something false about Kant or whatever. I mean, maybe it says something false and you've got something that's wrong in your essay, but come on, you're a student, you have other things in your essay that are wrong. It's my job to tell you when something was wrong and to explain to you what was the right thing. I mean, I'm not really afraid of that. I'm much more afraid of students who spend a lot of time talking to things like ChatGPT, and they think that they've been thinking, and they write it up in an essay and they send it to me, but they haven't been thinking. And so they get some feedback from me, but feedback on stuff that you haven't really thought about is not going to be very useful. And it's not clear whether it's going to get you to think. Maybe you're going to take the feedback into ChatGPT and you say, isn't my teacher a bit wrong about this? And ChatGPT is going to say, oh, well, there's a lot of things that you could have answered your teacher. I mean, I'm not going to say that that's going to literally happen, but I think this is a kind of sort of psychological state or a kind of process of intellectual self-deception that hasn't really been possible in this way before, and that these chatbots make possible not only on a very large scale, but actually they sort of actively encourage it. And I know this because I have fallen into this trap myself, right? I had too. I thought, well, what about this? Did anyone think of this? Is it a good idea? And I did put it into ChatGPT, mostly to maybe get some literature references, but you almost immediately get sidetracked into ChatGPT telling you how smart you are and developing the idea for you or allowing you to develop it and so on and so forth. So, to wrap all of this up, I think the way that large language models, very interesting technology. And if you interact with a bare large language model, I don't really think you can take it for something else than it is, because it's very obvious what it's doing. And although there might be a lot of dubious stuff on, let's say, the ethical side about where does the information come from, and on the environmental cost side, it's very hard for me to imagine that just engaging with large language models is going to have a lot of bad consequences for you as the user, in the sense of, getting wrong stuff out of it. Yeah, whatever. I mean, you see the technology for what it is, you recognize the wrong stuff for what it is, you don't even really see it as wrong, you're not going to rely on it to be true anyway. But there's this first kind of deception where the technology is presented to us, masked in a way that makes us almost unable to see it for what it really is, right? We hardly see the large language model predicting text tokens behind the chatbot interface, which seems to be this helpful first-person nice guy who knows a lot, who is self-aware about his knowledge, or her knowledge, or its knowledge, who knows, who's self-aware about its knowledge, and who is trying to answer your questions. And then becomes really weird in certain cases, but that's just an hallucination that we're going to solve, right? So I think that's, in order to understand what's going on, in order to understand when it might be advisable or not advisable to even use this technology, you've got to rip away that layer of deception. But, as I said, what's even more sort of interesting to me personally, maybe in part because I've kind of experienced it, is this second kind of deception where we use the technology to deceive ourselves, right? Where we use this nice sounding, positive, always giving compliments, thinking along with you, artificial intelligence assistant to deceive ourselves into thinking that we are smart, that our ideas are good, and most importantly, that we have thought when we haven't thought at all. So, my problem is not so much that these large language models don't think. Of course they don't think. My problem is that these large language models, in the way that they're set up with these chatbots around them, make it very easy for us to deceive ourselves about our own thinking and make us believe that we have done a lot of thinking when we have actually done basically nothing. I hope that was enlightening to you. There are lots of other ways to think about this technology. There are lots of angles from which to explore it. There's a lot of good stuff on the internet that I've heard and seen and read. But this, I think, is a take that I haven't seen it precisely like this, especially the last part that I talked about. It's something that I think is very important and that explains some of the popularity of these AI agents in ways that go beyond pointing at usefulness, because I think a lot of the conversations that people are having with them are not about usefulness at all. I mean, it's not about getting a particular answer to a particular question. It's not about getting a particular end product that you can use. A lot of it is people sort of falling into this trap almost of this very positive, nice kind of conversation where you are feeling good about almost everything, including your own thinking. But that is just us deceiving ourselves using this amazingly expensive technology. It would be a bit sad if that turns out to be its main use case, of course. Well, that's something that we'll have to see in the future, but I'm a bit worried that it's one of its main use cases and one of the main reasons that it's popular at the moment. All right, thank you for listening.